Brought to you by Wondrium. Check out these 2 pages from the Gospel of Thomas. They look pretty similar, right? So many letters look exactly the same. However, even though they are written with almost identical scripts, they're actually 2 distinct languages. The one on the left is Papyrus Oxyrhynchus I, a 3rd century manuscript written in Greek. The one on the right is a page from Nag Hammadi Codex number 2, a 4th century codex written in Coptic, the final form of the ancient Egyptian language. Coptic is especially important for those who study ancient Mediterranean religions, because Egypt's dry climate preserves so many manuscripts in this language. In this video, we'll offer an introduction to Coptic, focusing on its development, importance for early Christian studies, its use in the early Islamic period, as well as its continued use today within the Coptic Orthodox Church. Let's start with Coptic as a language and its dialects. Coptic is one form of the Egyptian language, a language perhaps best known for its earlier rendering in the hieroglyphic script. Egyptologists generally talk about the Egyptian language as having 5 distinct forms: Old Egyptian, used in the 3rd millennium BCE with hieroglyphic script; Middle or Classical Egyptian, used especially in the 2nd millennium BCE and written either in hieroglyphs or a cursive form of hieroglyphs called hieratic; Late Egyptian; Demotic, another cursive script of Egyptian used especially from 650 BCE to around 400 CE; and finally, Coptic, an Egyptian script that borrowed heavily from Greek and Demotic and developed substantially from the 3rd century CE onwards. Coptic is the last form of the Egyptian language before the predominance of Arabic in Egypt. To help differentiate, some scholars call the actual language Egyptian and only the script Coptic, sort of like how I'm currently using the English language, but I write and read in Latin script. Coptic, as a form of Egyptian, is also part of the Afroasiatic language family. This means that it's related to Semitic languages like Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and Ge'ez, as well as Chadic languages like Hausa and Cushitic languages like Somali. While scholars of the ancient Mediterranean tend to focus on how Coptic texts can help them better understand things like early Christian history, it's also important to remember that Coptic is an African language and can be used to help us better understand ancient northeastern African history. Coptic has a variety of different dialects. These dialects can be so different from one another that some scholars actually treat Coptic as a family of closely related dialects that descended from Egyptian, rather than as one distinct language. Coptic dialects tended to develop along the Nile Valley, since this was the main mode of communication and transportation from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt. So let's follow the south to north flow of the Nile to look at each one of these dialects. The most popular dialect in Upper Egypt, represented by the S here, is Saitic. This is the dialect that most students of ancient Coptic learn first, since it was especially used for Coptic translations of Greek biblical texts, as well as for the literary works and sermons of a famous Christian monk named Shenouda. More on him later. The A stands for Akhmimic, a dialect that stretched throughout Upper Egypt, from Aswan to Akhmim, which was a major center of Coptic culture in late antiquity. The L represents Lycopolitan, sometimes also called Sub-Akhmimic since it was thought to be a sub-dialect of Akhmimic. This dialect is really important for scholars of early Christianity because many texts preserved in the Nag Hammadi codices use this dialect, as well as some Manichaean writings from the Dakhla Oasis. The M further north stands for Mesochemic or Middle Egyptian, a term that's a little confusing because Middle Egyptian is also what we call the 2nd major stage of the Egyptian language, so some scholars have shifted to calling this Oxyrhynchite, after the city of Oxyrhynchus, where bunches of ancient manuscripts have been discovered, including that manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas that we started with. The F here is next to a fertile basin west of the Nile called the Fayum Oasis, and the dialect found here we call Fayumic. It's best known for transposing the R sound into an L and E into I, so a common Coptic word like Rome, meaning human, is written as Lomi. Finally, in the Nile Delta, we have B, which stands for Bohairic. This dialect became especially popular from the 10th century onward due to its use by the monastic communities of Scetis, south of Alexandria, monastic communities that are still active to this day. Bohairic is the main surviving dialect of Coptic, since it remains the liturgical language of both the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Coptic Catholic Church. It's also the most distinct from all other Coptic dialects. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about Coptic's backstory as an Egyptian language and its various dialects, we can turn back to where we started, the Coptic script. As we've alluded to, Coptic looks a lot like Greek. In fact, every single letter in the Greek alphabet appears in the Coptic alphabet, plus a few extras. Why is that? From what we can tell, Coptic developed in part because of the work of Egyptian writers who were part of the priestly class, that is to say, those who were affiliated with temples and had some knowledge of hieroglyphic or hieratic script. Around the 1st to 3rd centuries CE, these priestly scribes started experimenting with the Greek alphabet to write Egyptian words, because many elite Egyptians had become familiar with the Greek language in the preceding centuries, thanks to Alexander the Great and his successors, the Ptolemies, who infused Greek culture, education, and writing into the Egyptian world. So all this to say, Coptic did not start as a brand new stage of Egyptian language. It started as a way to write earlier forms of Egyptian words in Greek script. For an example, consider the London Magical Papyrus, dated to around the 3rd century CE. It contains a series of spells for divination, love, and cursing, written in an older version of the Egyptian script called Demotic. However, the scribes who worked with this papyrus also used the Greek alphabet in the margins and the spaces between the lines, as they were glossing words and writing out notes. Especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, this trend continued, with some writers of magical and astronomical texts writing out entire pieces of Egyptian language in Greek script. During this time, Egyptian writers found that the Greek alphabet did not provide all of the sounds that they needed to render Egyptian words. So they borrowed some symbols from the Demotic script to fill in sounds that they needed, like the Coptic letter shai for a sh sound and chima for a ky sound, kind of like the C in the English word cute. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, we encounter the Coptic script primarily as a way both to make Egyptian language intelligible to those who know the Greek alphabet and to make Greek texts intelligible to those who know the Egyptian language. We see the latter especially in the explosion of biblical texts that are translated from Greek into Coptic in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. Under Greek and later Roman colonization, Coptic functioned as a hybridized language and script that allowed ancient Egyptians to participate in the Hellenized literary culture that surrounded them. Remember, by the late Roman period, Egyptians had lived under Greek or Roman rule for hundreds of years. Because of its reliance on primarily Greek script, Coptic also borrows a substantial amount of Greek loanwords, such as angelos for angel and ekklesia for church. In some texts, around 25% of all of its words are borrowed from Greek. But of course, Coptic also retains some older Egyptian words. For example, the Egyptian word for great house, per-a'a, is retained in the Coptic word paro, the term for pharaoh, or the king. Coptic script itself went on to influence the writing of Old Nubian, a medieval language used in the kingdom of Mercuria. Coptic has also heavily influenced Egyptian Arabic, and many towns and cities in Egypt maintain their ancient Egyptian names, like Aswan, from the Coptic Suwan. So what kind of texts are preserved in Coptic? While we can't cover every type of text here, we can highlight some of the most prominent examples. Around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Coptic was mostly used early on in rural contexts, particularly for letters, annotations, glossaries, and school exercises alongside Greek. This is based on what we see in Coptic texts from places like Kelis, Nag Hammadi, and the Karga and Dakhla oases. The fact that Coptic was showing up in texts like glossaries and school exercises shows that Coptic was first used to help readers who wanted to fit into the project of Hellenization that had been occurring over the course of centuries in Roman Egypt. Because of this, a lot of our earliest Coptic literary texts are not new literary productions, like a native Coptic novel, for example, but rather the texts are translations of Greek texts, especially biblical texts and other early Christian literature. The best example of this is the Nag Hammadi codices. These are a set of 13 codices found in Upper Egypt in the 1940s that contain a range of texts translated from Greek into Coptic, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, as well as a fragment of Plato's Republic. Another good example is the Bodmer Papyri, a collection of 22 manuscripts from the village of Dishna, which were smuggled out of Egypt in the 1950s and are now kept primarily in Switzerland and the Vatican. Among the Bodmer Papyri are a range of Greek and Coptic texts from late antiquity, especially biblical books. On the Coptic side, we have a range of 4th and 5th century manuscripts, including books from the Hebrew Bible like Genesis, Exodus, and prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah, as well as New Testament books like Matthew, Romans, and 2 Corinthians, making them extremely valuable for understanding early Christian readership of biblical literature. Another important category of early Coptic literature is literature written by monks, particularly particularly since Christian monks were among the most prolific Coptic writers and translators. Some scholars even argue that Christian monks were the translators and users of the Nag Hammadi codices, which complicates how traditional scholarship in early Christian studies has tried to classify monks as orthodox and whoever used those codices as Gnostics or heretics. The lines were much more blurry than is commonly assumed. The most prominent Coptic writer in the monastic landscape is Shenouda the Great, the leader of a monastic federation in Upper Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries. Shenouda wrote so much in Coptic that we still have not organized and published all of it into English. Shenouda produced all sorts of sermons and treatises, especially on how to live a moral monastic life and on various opponents whom he deemed pagan or heretical. Many of his texts were preserved at his headquarters, the White Monastery, located near modern-day Sohag, along with other texts that made it one of the largest monastic libraries in late antique Egypt. However, the library was divided up by 19th century colonists and European antiquities traffickers, so now pieces of Shenouda's works and other texts from the White Monastery are spread from Moscow to Michigan. One of the main jobs of many Coptologists today is basically detective work, sifting through the archives of Western libraries and museums to locate Coptic manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts, and attempting to piece them together with other texts or fragments from around the world. Beyond monastic literature, we also have Manichaean texts preserved in Coptic. You can watch my full video on Manichaeism here, but briefly, Manichaeism was an ancient religion named after the 3rd century visionary and prophet Mani that spread across the world from China to Rome. Even though the prophet Mani was most active in the Sasanian Empire, his disciples and teachings caught on quite early in Egypt. Two of the most important Manichaean texts written in Coptic are the Manichaean Psalter, a 3rd or 4th century collection of Manichaean psalms found in the Fayum that connect Mani to figures like Adam and Enoch, and the Kephaliah, or chapters, a collection of sayings, teachings, and interpretations of the prophet Mani that function kind of like the Hadith do in Islam. Likewise, Coptic magical papyri were extremely prominent. There are literally hundreds of Coptic magical texts from the late antique and medieval periods, which range from protective amulets and love spells to curses and wishes for luck. For example, this Coptic magical text on screen was composed, folded up, and likely deposited somewhere in order to be activated. It lists a series of divine names, begging them to take away the supplicant's fever. Seeking out religious experts who could help produce such texts was probably a common practice in late antique Egypt. Let's turn now to the later history of Coptic. As we've just seen, Coptic is especially well known as a language for ancient texts, especially early Christian biblical translation, monastic texts, and so-called heretical treatises like the Nag Hammadi codices. But Coptic was also an important administrative language from antiquity into the early Islamic period, though it took a few centuries for it to usurp this role from the Greek language. Egyptian monks like John of Lycopolis did not really know Greek, but nevertheless, they wrote bureaucratic petitions in terrible Greek because that was the language of government. They believed Coptic was not a language meant to be used for Hellenized administrative correspondence. And the fact that Coptic was not a very standardized language probably hindered its uptake in administrative contexts. With so many dialects, it was not an efficient lingua franca for administration. But by the 6th and 7th centuries, Coptic became more and more popular in urban centers. It was used especially for legal disputes between Egyptians who might want to solve the problem among themselves rather than bringing it to an urban Greek court system. Coptic remained a prominent legal language well into the 10th century, when Arabic began to replace it as Egypt's administrative language, following the Muslim conquest of the region in the 7th century. A good example from this time period is a collection of texts from the monastery of Apa Foibamon, which was built directly into the mortuary temple of the New Kingdom pharaoh Hatshepsut, near modern-day Luxor. The monastery was an administrative hub for the region, with an archive containing bunches of economic documents in Coptic, and even a Coptic copy of the monastery's own charter, shown here on screen. Starting in the medieval period, Coptic appeared alongside Arabic in ecclesiastical texts, like prayer books and psalters, as well as biblical texts like this 14th century gospel book from the monastery of St. Macarius, that's open to the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Coptic remained a spoken language until around the 17th century, especially in Upper Egypt. Though some reports say it may have persisted sometime longer, Arabic had long since become the primary spoken language. In the 14th century, the Coptic bishop Athanasius of Kos lamented the decline of Coptic in his grammar book. For the people of this time, in this land, their language has become forgotten. Others have not abandoned their language as we have ours. Starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attempts have been made to revive Coptic as a spoken language. One of the most prominent revivalists was the Coptic Egyptologist and linguist named Claudius Labib, who is said to have gone so far as to teach Coptic to his household and encourage them to use it in daily life. He also was the editor-in-chief of the first Coptic language periodical magazine, Ein Shams. Labib and other activists encouraged learning Coptic as part of a larger project to develop a sense of Coptic cultural identity within the Muslim-majority Egyptian nation-state. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, figures like Pope Cyril VI, Pope Shenouda III, and Emil Ishaq encouraged learning Coptic and produced Coptic grammars and school books, as well as started educational programs for Coptic Orthodox Christians. While spoken Coptic has not at this point been revitalized as a spoken language, you can still hear it today in a Coptic church or in a college classroom at a select few universities. As we noted earlier, Bohairic Coptic persists as the liturgical language of Coptic Christians. Coptic Christians make up about 10% of the population in Egypt, and there are also sizable diaspora communities around the world. Today you can see Coptic decorating churches around Egypt inside and out, and scripture readings and prayers are recited in Coptic during services. Coptic also continues to expand in the Western world, as scholars increasingly realize that it's a vital academic language for understanding monasticism, early Christianity, and the history of Egypt itself. If you'd like to learn more about Coptic, I'm putting some resources in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks to Wondrium for sponsoring this video. Wondrium is an online learning platform where you can find tons of high-quality educational content. Today's topic was on Coptic, the final form of the ancient Egyptian language. And if you're a language nerd, you should really check out Wondrium. It's an excellent language learning platform. There are entire series on ancient languages like Biblical Hebrew, Latin, and Ancient Greek, as well as modern languages like Italian, German, and American Sign Language. And these are full courses, sometimes with dozens of lessons. For example, the Latin 101 class is 36 lectures long, which is basically like taking a semester-long course of Latin in college. And the series is taught by a college professor, the classicist Hans Friedrich Müller, who teaches at Union College. There are also series on the history, sociology, and neuroscience of language, like their series Language and the Mind, which examines the evolution of language from the perspective of psychology and neuroscience. If you'd like to give Wondrium a try, Wondrium is offering viewers a free trial. Head on over to wondrium.com/religionforbreakfast or click the link in the comments below. Thanks, everyone.